Welcome back, everyone. Let's pick up from where we left off. So when last we were here, we had 333, a great year, BCE. Greece becomes a major part of the Jewish Christian tradition. At this point, it's Judaism, and Judaism is under the control of Persia. Greece comes in, takes over, and wants everyone to learn Greek. As I mentioned, some people had problems with this. You had a group of very nationalistic interests that wrote something like the Book of the Watchers, which is one of the first major apocalypses that we have. Didn't make it into the canon, but it was certainly influential. The Book of the Watchers, this text basically said anyone who takes on Greek culture will end up deserving the same destruction and the same eternal torture as the angels that fell. More on that later, but for right now, that's basically the major resistance against Greek culture. For the most part, the majority of groups accepted Greek culture to the extent that all Hebrew texts, all of the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek in what we would call the Septuagint, and the main language of Hebrew was practically lost. It became just a part of life in the synagogue, and Aramaic and Greek became the major languages. Hebrew is used sparingly only in the synagogues, and all the texts now are translated into Greek, and new texts that are written at this time, like the Maccabees, or like Judith, or like other major texts at this time, are mainly in Greek, without any Hebrew background. So this will be one of the biggest reasons now why biblical scholars, and in particular New Testament scholars, need to learn Greek. It's because of Alexander the Great. That was the good period for Greek-Jewish relationships. Then you had this period. After 170, you had Antiochus IV Epiphanes come into power. He was essentially the king, the Greek king at this time, who had his position in Syria, and he basically, after a very bad day, he lost a battle with Egypt. He had to pay a massive sum, and he went to Jerusalem to basically take the money out of the temple to pay a ransom to Egypt. And needless to say, the Jerusalem community were very upset at a non-Jew going into the temple. There was a riot. He got very upset at that and was so offended that he told people, listen, the reason why you don't respect me as a deity, as a divine king, is because of your law. So I'm going to nullify your law. And that's basically what he did. He made it illegal to follow the covenant. Anything that's from Genesis to Deuteronomy, it became illegal to do. Women who had their children circumcised were executed with their children hanging around their necks. If you didn't eat pork, you could be executed. If you didn't march in a parade to celebrate Antiochus or other Greek gods, you were executed. So this is where we have now the Maccabean revolt. And we also have major apocalyptic texts, Animal Apocalypse, which doesn't make it into the canon, but Daniel, which does, and a lot of others that are being written at this time because, as we'll see later, apocalyptic texts come from situations of persecution. Second Maccabees talks about a lot of this persecution. We'll get into it a little bit in this course. But for right now, this is the major event that changes the direction of ancient Israel. Because from here on, they're going to have 100 years after the Maccabean revolt where they actually succeed. They take power back. They beat the Greeks. And then you have a century of corrupt Jewish leadership and selling of the high priesthood and other things like that, that ends up setting the stage for what comes next when the Romans come in. By the time the Romans come in, there was already a concern about corruption in the leadership. Rome came in and basically took all the land and then gave the land to people that they wanted to. They gave the land to people that would benefit their own perspective, their own rulership. And so there were lots of revolts during this time. messianic revolts, people that would find somebody that was a charismatic leader, and this charismatic leader would say, let's go beat Rome. And they'd say, great. And then you'd have hundreds or thousands of Galileans or Jews rushing out and then being slaughtered by legions of the Romans. It was a very difficult time, and it's this time right here over the next 50, 60 years into which Jesus is born and in which Jesus grows up. The relationship between the Jews and Romans is not at all what it was in the first 100 or 50 years or so of under Alexander in Greece, where it was, here, learn Greek and pay your tithe and you can worship whatever you want. It wasn't as bad as under Antiochus IV either. It was in between, where individuals were overtaxed, they lost their land, and they looked for a situation where they said, hey, if we kept the covenant, we were supposed to be able to keep the land. Why did these Gentiles come in and take the land from us? And so there's this need amongst the Jews to say, something's wrong, and something needs to be fixed significantly. And that's why apocalyptic texts continue to grow during this time, and why Christianity would have that apocalyptic tinge to it. Needless to say, 33 to 39 are going to be major events for the early church. Rome is still in charge and will remain in charge for centuries more. But Christianity develops at this time and grows. Christianity as a faith is not something that is beneficial to people who are already in power. Christianity, at the core of the gospel, challenges authority. It challenges the concept of human power and requires people to focus on the power of God and God's authority in our lives. Pentecost is seen as the significant start of the church, but Jesus' ministry is already the beginning and the initiation of proclaiming the gospel and of announcing salvation to humanity. The church now, after the crucifixion and resurrection, through the apostles, through the ministry of the church, is called now to continue that expression. One of the biggest changes, though, is that just as we saw earlier when the Jews returned from exile and came back to Jerusalem, there was that concern about, well, who are we as a people? Is our theology our people's theology, or is our theology about God? And one of the concerns here became early Christians who were Jewish, because Christianity started as a Jewish faith. There were some individuals that said, look, this is our faith. This is our people. This is our tradition. You can't just have people outside our tradition come in and get the same things we do, the same baptism, the same salvation, the same eternal covenant with God. That's not fair. But the early church saw from the beginning that there were some Jews that didn't accept the gospel, and there were a number of Gentiles who did. How do you tell those Gentiles, no, you can't have the gospel once they hear it? And that is how the church continued to grow. But before this became a predominantly Gentile church, the first major question of identity in the early church was, how are we a Jewish faith? And how are we maintaining this Jewish faith from the Jewish scriptures that talks about the return of the Jewish Messiah to bring about the kingdom that was promised in the Jewish scriptures? How do we make that all work and allow Gentiles in? And it was the power of the Spirit that basically said, we don't get to choose who gets in, the Spirit chooses. And that's what the book of Acts, especially chapters 1 through 15, is all about. The Jerusalem Council in 50 is one of the major marking points. Whatever happened in 50, Acts 15 describes it one way, Galatians chapter 2 describes it another. Whatever happened in 50, one thing that is clear is that at some point the church decided, okay, here's what you need to do in order to be a member of this community and in order to be baptized and received into the community and to be able to take part in the Eucharist. You don't necessarily have to be Jewish or maintain Jewish customs to do this. You can be an outsider. You can be a non-Jew and participate in this faith. And that will be a major shift for this community. Paul's ministry, Paul had, there are 13 letters attributed to Paul, possibly 7 to 10 that he wrote. Others are questioned. But for now, it's worthwhile to note that between 48 and 62, a lot of the texts that form our New Testament were written, but they were written as letters. Before the Gospels were written, while the Gospels were still being collected, letters were being written to communicate in a situational manner from a pastor to a community. This is what I think the gospel is. This is how I think we need to live it out in our community at this time now. And Paul was a major writer of that, but we shouldn't lose perspective on the fact the letters to the Hebrews, the letter from James, 1 Peter, these are also major works that were extremely influential in the early church and also deserve considerable notice just as much as Paul. A significant point also in the persecution of Christians is 60 to 64. This will be a turning point for the church because the Gospel of Mark will look on this as a time of trauma that they will write from. And also, Peter and Paul are martyred this time. The church is losing its major leaders, and so there becomes a not so much a power vacuum, but a leadership vacuum, and there's a need to be able to proclaim the story of the gospel in a new way. 70 is absolutely one of the marks that defines the early church. When the Second Temple falls to Rome, this becomes the marker that early Christians say, okay, this is it. This is what the book of Daniel was talking about. This is where we see the resurrection, the empty tomb, and now the destruction, the empty tomb in 33, and now the destruction of the temple in 70. This is what Jesus was talking about. And for a lot of texts, 70 will be the time that they will look back on or will create or initiate the need to write down texts such as Mark's Gospel, or the Gospel from Mark. It definitely seems to be written at this time and seems to view the prophecies of Daniel as being fulfilled in the destruction of the temple, and now the next thing is Christ's return. The Gospel tradition will continue to grow over the next 15 to 20 years. Matthew, very likely written in Antioch in 80. Luke's Gospel could be written from anywhere, but very likely, just as Matthew likely used Mark, Luke might have used Matthew and Mark. Or Luke might have also written later and used John. John's Gospel is extremely complex. The composition is extremely complex. It could have been written any time between 60 and 90, and it seems to have multiple stages of being written. But that's another class and another story. From 90 to 100, you have a major persecution that creates a need for early Christians to consider how exactly are we going to exist in this empire. And it challenges a lot of Christians. It challenges a lot of their faith. And some of the texts in the New Testament will start to ask the question, how can we be Christians and also good Roman citizens? And you can see that, especially in the pastoral letters. You can see that even in 1 Peter, there's an attempt there. Okay, I'm a Christian, but I'm living in Rome. How can I be a good citizen of this empire, but also live out my faith in Jesus Christ? And that becomes a theological challenge. All of these texts, everything that's going on in these 27 texts that end up becoming the New Testament, they are not the only texts that are out there. It will take an entire new series, an entire new set of challenges, and basically a new emperor to come along to legalize Christianity so that they can now have these discussions in the open in terms of what is our canon, how are we supposed to do this, and also the challenge of who is Christ, how do we understand Jesus Christ in order to finalize what exactly is going on here. The New Testament canon is, for the most part, solidified between 325 and 419. It won't be closed until the Council of Trent in 1570. But between 300 and 400, the text, the 27 texts of the New Testament and the texts of the Old Testament are solidified and understood as Christian scripture. And that's how things got this way.